The telegram from the bank arrived on a Tuesday morning in October 1881, and Tabitha Kensington knew, before she even opened it, that her world was about to collapse. Standing on the dusty main street of Leadville, Colorado, with the autumn wind whipping her dark hair across her face, she stared at the paper in her trembling hands and read the words that confirmed her worst fears. The loan on her father's silver mine was being called in immediately, and without payment within 30 days, the bank would seize not just the mine but the equipment, the land, and everything her family had built over the past 15 years. Her father had died 6 months earlier in a mining accident, leaving Tabitha, at 23 years old, to manage both the mine and the considerable debts he had accumulated trying to keep it operational. The silver vein had run thin 2 years back, and every cent they earned went straight to paying the workers and keeping food on the table for the families who depended on the mine for their livelihoods. Leadville had boomed in the late 70s, when silver was discovered in the surrounding mountains, transforming from a dying gold camp into a thriving city of 15,000 souls practically overnight. But the boom was fickle, and mines that dried up meant entire families left destitute, businesses shuttered, dreams abandoned to the harsh Colorado mountain winter that was already sending its first warnings in the form of frost-touched mornings. Tabitha walked slowly back to the small house she shared with her younger sister, Penelope, her boots kicking up dust with each heavy step. The town stretched around her in all its contradictions. Elegant brick buildings stood next to ramshackle wooden structures. Well-dressed businessmen passed by rough miners still covered in the day's dirt, and the sound of a piano playing in one of the many saloons mingled with the ring of a blacksmith's hammer. Leadville was a place where fortunes were made and lost on the turn of a shovel, where hope and desperation walked hand in hand down streets that turned to mud whenever it rained. Penelope was sitting at the kitchen table when Tabitha entered, her younger sister's face lighting up before immediately falling when she saw Tabitha's expression. At 19, Penelope still had the optimism of youth, still believed that everything would somehow work itself out if they just tried hard enough. Tabitha had believed that too once, before watching her father slowly kill himself working 18-hour days in a mine that gave back less and less with each passing month. "What is it?" Penelope asked, rising from her chair, her blonde hair pulled back in a simple braid. Tabitha placed the telegram on the table between them. "The bank is calling in father's loan. We have 30 days to pay $15,000 or they take everything." The color drained from Penelope's face. "15,000, but we barely have 300 in savings. The mine has not made a profit in over a year. What are we going to do?" That was the question that kept Tabitha awake for the next 3 nights, pacing her small bedroom while her mind raced through every possible solution and found each one wanting. She could try to sell the mine, but who would buy a dried-up claim with more debt than prospects? She could ask for an extension, but the bank had already granted 2, and the hard-eyed banker had made it clear there would be no more chances. She could try to find investors, but every man with money in Leadville was either already invested in better prospects or too smart to throw good money after bad. On the 4th day, sitting in the office of the mine with the account books spread before her like a catalog of failure, an idea came to her that was so desperate, so audacious, that she immediately tried to push it away. But it returned, again and again, because underneath the scandal and impropriety of it, there was a terrible logic that she could not deny. That evening, she called a meeting of the mine workers and their families in the large barn that served as a community gathering place. 47 people depended directly on the mine for their income, and twice that many depended indirectly on the money those workers spent in town. When they were all assembled, faces worried and expectant in the lamplight, Tabitha stood before them and explained the situation with a directness that left no room for false comfort. "I have thought of every possible solution," she said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart, "and I have found only one that might work, though it requires something from me that I never imagined I would have to give." She paused, looking at the faces of people she had known her entire life. The Rodriguez family, whose 3 sons worked the deep shafts. Old Samuel Porter, who had taught her father everything he knew about following a vein. Martha and Henry Williams, whose daughter had just been born and who had nowhere else to go if the mine closed. "I am going to hold an auction," Tabitha continued, and the murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd. "An auction in which I offer myself as a bride to the highest bidder. Whatever money is raised will go directly to paying off the bank loan and keeping the mine operational. I am asking for your permission to do this because it affects all of you, and because I need your help to make it known throughout Leadville and the surrounding camps." The silence that followed was absolute and terrible. Then everyone started talking at once, voices rising in protest, shock, and disbelief. Penelope, who had been standing to the side, pushed through the crowd to grab Tabitha's arm. "You cannot be serious," she said, her eyes wide with horror. "This is insane. There has to be another way." "There is not," Tabitha said quietly. "I have looked at every option, Penelope. This is all I have left to give." Martha Williams stepped forward, her infant daughter in her arms. "Miss Kensington, we cannot let you do this. The shame of it, the danger. You do not know what kind of man might bid on you." "I know exactly what kind of men are in Leadville," Tabitha replied. "Prospectors, gamblers, businessmen, workers. Some good, some bad, most somewhere in between. But a public auction means there will be witnesses, means there will be accountability. And I will make the terms very clear. Whoever wins is buying a legal marriage, nothing more. What happens after that will be between me and my husband, but the money will save the mine and all of your jobs." Samuel Porter spoke up, his voice rough with emotion. "Your father would never have wanted this, girl. He would have rather lost everything than see you sold like livestock." "My father is dead," Tabitha said, and the harshness of her own words surprised her. "He worked himself to death trying to save something that maybe could not be saved, and I watched him do it. But I am not dead, and neither are any of you, and I will not let this mine close and destroy all these families if there is anything I can do to prevent it. So I am asking you, will you help me spread the word, or will you accept that in 30 days everything ends?" The debate went on for another hour, voices rising and falling, arguments made and countered. But in the end, the terrible mathematics of desperation won out. The workers agreed to spread word of the auction, and the women, though many wept as they did so, agreed to help Tabitha prepare for what she was about to do. Over the next 2 weeks, word of the auction spread through Leadville like wildfire and beyond into the surrounding mining camps and settlements. A woman auctioning herself to save a failing mine was exactly the kind of story that captured imaginations in a place where the extraordinary was commonplace, and everyone understood the kind of desperation that drove people to extreme measures. Some called Tabitha brave, others called her foolish, and more than a few called her far worse things. But everyone agreed that they wanted to see what would happen on the day of the auction. Tabitha spent those 2 weeks in a strange state between numbness and panic, going through the motions of daily life while her mind spun with possibilities both hopeful and horrifying. She was gambling everything on the chance that someone with money would be curious enough, or kind enough, or interested enough to bid high, but there were no guarantees. She could end up married to a cruel man, A violent man, a man who saw her as property bought and paid for. She could end up raising barely enough money to make a dent in the debt. She could end up humiliated before the entire town for nothing. Penelope barely spoke to her for the first week, her sister's hurt and anger creating a wall between them that Tabitha did not have the energy to breach. But on the evening of the 8th day, Penelope came to Tabitha's room where she sat staring out the window at the mountains that ringed the town, their peaks already white with early snow. "I am still angry with you," Penelope said quietly, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I think this is the most foolish, dangerous thing you could possibly do. But I also know that you are doing it because you think it is right, because you want to save those families, and I cannot hate you for that. So I am going to help you, and I am going to stand beside you when this happens, and I am going to pray that whoever bids on you is a good man who will treat you with the respect you deserve." Tabitha reached out and took her sister's hand, squeezing it tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. And that was all either of them could manage before emotion overwhelmed words. On the morning of the auction, Leadville seemed to hold its breath. The event was scheduled for noon in front of the town hall, the same place where mining claims were registered and public notices posted. By 11 o'clock, a crowd had already begun to gather, and by 11:30, it seemed like half the town had turned out to witness the spectacle. Tabitha stood inside the town hall, dressed in her best dress, a simple but elegant blue cotton that had belonged to her mother. Her hands shook as she tried to pin her hair into some semblance of order, and Martha Williams, who had appointed herself Tabitha's guardian for the day, gently took the pins from her fingers and finished the job. "You do not have to go through with this," Martha said softly. "Even now you could walk away." "No," Tabitha said, meeting her own eyes in the small mirror. "I could not." At precisely noon, Mayor Christopher Dalton, a florid-faced man who had made his fortune in hardware supply, stepped out onto the raised platform in front of the town hall. The crowd pressed close, a sea of faces ranging from sympathetic to curious to leering. Tabitha followed the mayor onto the platform, her spine straight and her chin up, determined not to show the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. The mayor cleared his throat and raised his hands for silence. The crowd slowly quieted, though the murmur of voices never entirely ceased. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mayor Dalton began, his voice carrying across the packed square, "we are here today for an unusual but entirely legal proceeding. Miss Tabitha Kensington has elected to auction herself in marriage, with all proceeds going to settle the debts of the Kensington silver mine, thereby preserving the livelihoods of nearly 50 families in our community. The terms are as follows. The highest bidder will enter into a legal marriage contract with Miss Kensington, to be performed immediately following the auction by Reverend Matthews. The marriage will be binding under the laws of the state of Colorado and the United States of America. Miss Kensington comes with no dowry beyond herself, and the winning bidder assumes no debts beyond the auction price itself. Bidding will start at $100. Tabitha scanned the crowd, trying to see who might bid, trying to prepare herself for what was coming. She saw familiar faces from the mine, their expressions troubled. She saw businessmen she knew by sight but not by name, some looking speculative, others uncomfortable. She saw rough miners and clean-shaven gamblers, cowboys in from the range and prospectors still dusty from their claims. And then she saw him. He stood at the back of the crowd, taller than most of the men around him, with dark hair visible beneath a worn black hat. He wore dusty traveling clothes, a long coat despite the mild autumn day, and there was something about the way he held himself, perfectly still and utterly focused, that drew her attention like a lodestone. Even from a distance, She could see the intensity of his gaze, directed entirely at her. $100, a voice called out, and Tabitha jerked her attention back to the crowd. A portly merchant she recognized as the owner of a dry goods store had raised his hand. 150. Another voice, this one belonging to a younger man she did not know. 200. A gambler from one of the saloons, dressed in a fancy vest. The bidding climbed steadily, and with each increase, Tabitha felt her heart sink a little further. She recognized most of the bidders now, could picture the kind of life she might have with each one. The merchant would probably treat her well enough, but expect her to run his household and produce children as predictably as his store produced profits. The young man looked earnest but poor, likely scraping together everything he had. The gambler had cold eyes that made her skin crawl. $500, the merchant again, his face reddening. 750. A mine owner she knew by reputation, a hard man who had worked his previous wife into an early grave. The bidding slowed as the price climbed past $1,000, then $1,500, then $2,000. Tabitha did the mathematics frantically in her head. Even at $2,000, it would not be nearly enough to cover the debt. The mine would still fail, and she would have sold herself for nothing. $2,500, the mine owner said, his voice confident. The crowd had gone quieter now, sensing the bidding was reaching its conclusion. Going once, Mayor Dalton called, his gavel raised. Tabitha closed her eyes, trying to prepare herself for what was coming. $15,000. The voice came from the back of the crowd, deep and calm and absolutely certain. Tabitha's eyes snapped open and the crowd parted slightly, everyone turning to stare at the tall man in the dusty coat who had spoken. "I am sorry. Could you repeat that?" Mayor Dalton asked, clearly convinced he had misheard. The man stepped forward, and now Tabitha could see him more clearly. He was younger than she had initially thought, probably no more than 28 or 30, with a strong jaw darkened by several days' worth of stubble and eyes that were a startling gray-blue, even in the bright midday sun. There was something about his face that suggested he had seen hard things and survived them, a weathered quality that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with experience. $15,000, he repeated, his eyes never leaving Tabitha's face. "That is the amount needed to clear the debt, is it not?" "It is," the mayor said slowly, "but that is a considerable sum, mister. Do you have proof you can pay it?" The man reached into his coat and pulled out a leather wallet which he handed to the mayor. Mayor Dalton opened it, and his eyes widened. He leafed through what appeared to be a thick stack of bank notes, then looked up at the stranger with new respect. "This appears to be in order," the mayor said. "Does anyone wish to bid higher than $15,000? Silence." The mine owner, who had bid $2,500, looked simultaneously relieved and disappointed. The crowd seemed to be holding its collective breath. "Going once," Mayor Dalton said. "Going twice." He brought the gavel down with a sharp crack. "Sold to the gentleman in the back for $15,000. May I have your name, sir, for the marriage certificate?" "Thomas Jarrett," the man said, and began making his way through the crowd toward the platform. Tabitha felt dizzy, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. He had bid the exact amount needed, down to the dollar. That could not be coincidence. He had known what she needed and had paid it without hesitation, without negotiation, as if $15,000 was a trifling sum. As he climbed the steps to the platform, she searched his face for some clue as to who he was and what he wanted. But his expression revealed nothing beyond a quiet intensity that made her pulse quicken. Thomas Jarrett stood before her, and up close, he was even more imposing than he had seemed from a distance. He was easily 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and the lean, muscular build of a man who spent his time in hard physical labor. His hands, she noticed, were calloused and scarred, the hands of someone who knew how to work. But his eyes, those strange gray-blue eyes, held an intelligence and a sadness that seemed at odds with his rough appearance. "Miss Kensington," he said quietly, and his voice had a slight drawl that suggested he had spent time in Texas or maybe New Mexico. "I reckon we should talk before we do this thing, if you are willing." "I think that would be wise," Tabitha managed, her own voice sounding strange to her ears. They stepped to the side of the platform, away from the mayor and the crowd and Reverend Matthews, who had appeared with his Bible and looked somewhat befuddled by the entire proceeding. Penelope had pushed her way through the crowd and stood at the base of the platform, her face pale but determined. "You bid exactly what I needed," Tabitha said quietly, studying Thomas Jarrett's face. "How did you know the amount?" "I made inquiries," he said simply. "When I heard about the auction, I wanted to know the facts before I came here." "Why?" The question burst from her before she could stop it. "Why would you do this? You do not know me. For all you know, I could be the worst wife imaginable." Something that might have been humor flickered in his eyes. "I reckon that is a risk I am willing to take." "But $15,000, Tabitha pressed. "That is a fortune. You could buy a ranch, start a business, do anything you wanted with that money. Why spend it on a stranger?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving past her to the mountains that ringed the town, then back to her face. "I have been drifting for a long time, Miss Kensington, working other men's cattle, digging other men's mines, fighting other men's fights. I have saved my money because I never had anything worth spending it on. And after a while, I stopped believing I would ever find something that was. Then I heard about what you were doing, about you offering yourself up to save a bunch of families you did not have to give a damn about, and I thought maybe I had finally found something worth the price." "You are paying $15,000 for the idea of me," Tabitha said, shaking her head. "For some romantic notion. You do not know who I actually am." "No," Thomas agreed, "but I figure we have the rest of our lives to learn that, if you are willing to go through with this." Tabitha looked at him, really looked at him, trying to see past the surface to the man beneath. He had saved her, saved the mine, saved those families without asking for anything in return. Even now, standing here, he was giving her a choice, asking her permission rather than claiming what he had bought. There was something deeply honest about him, something that felt solid in a way that very little in her life had felt for a very long time. "What do you want from me?" she asked quietly. "Truly, a chance," Thomas said. "That is all. A chance to see if maybe we can build something together, something real. And if it turns out we cannot, if you decide you hate me or I am not what you hoped for, then we will figure that out when we get there. But right now, in this moment, I am asking you to take a leap of faith. Same as I am doing." Tabitha looked down at Penelope, who nodded almost imperceptibly. She looked out at the crowd, at the faces of the mine workers and their families, who were watching with hope and fear intermingled. She looked back at Thomas Jarrett, this stranger who had just paid a fortune for a bride he did not know. "All right," she said. "Let us do this thing." The wedding ceremony was short and practical, Reverend Matthews rushing through the words as if speed might somehow make the unusual circumstances less irregular. Tabitha spoke her vows in a clear voice, determined not to falter, and Thomas repeated his own vows with a quiet certainty that steadied her. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, Thomas did not try to kiss her, simply took her hand in his and gave it a gentle squeeze. The crowd erupted into a mixture of applause and speculation, and Mayor Dalton collected the $15,000 from Thomas with the solemnity of a man handling church offerings. Tabitha signed the papers that transferred the money to the bank, her hand shaking slightly as she wrote her new name for the first time. Tabitha Jarrett. When the official business was done, Thomas turned to her and spoke quietly. "I have a room at the Columbine Hotel. We can go there to talk privately if you want, or if you would rather go to your own home for now, I understand that too." "The hotel," Tabitha said, surprising herself. "But my sister should come too so I can explain things to her." Thomas nodded. "Of course." The three of them walked through the streets of Leadville together, Tabitha in the middle, her new husband on one side and her sister on the other, while behind them the crowd slowly dispersed, already turning the auction into the legend it would become. People stared as they passed, and Tabitha kept her head high, refusing to show any shame or uncertainty. The Columbine Hotel was one of the nicer establishments in town, a 3-story brick building with actual glass windows and a lobby that featured imported furniture from the East. Thomas led them up to a room on the second floor, a space that was simple but clean, with a bed, a table and chairs, and a window that looked out over the main street. Penelope sat in one of the chairs, looking exhausted, while Tabitha and Thomas remained standing. The silence stretched between them, full of questions and uncertainties. "I do not even know where you are from," Tabitha finally said. "Anything about you, really, except your name." Thomas removed his hat, setting it on the table, and ran a hand through his dark hair. "I was born in Texas, just outside San Antonio. My parents had a small ranch, nothing fancy, but it was home. They died of fever when I was 17, and I sold the ranch to pay their debts. Since then, I have been moving around, working where I could find it. Cattle drives, mining, some work as a deputy in New Mexico for a while. I am 30 years old, and until about an hour ago, I never thought I would get married." "Why not?" Penelope asked, speaking for the first time since they left the square. Thomas looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Because I never met anyone who made me want to stop moving, I guess. And because the kind of women I met were not the kind you marry, or they were already married to someone else. It is not an excuse, just the way things were." "And now?" Tabitha asked. "Now I am married to a woman I do not know who was brave enough or desperate enough to auction herself to save a bunch of people she cared about," Thomas said. "And I am hoping that maybe we can figure out how to make this work, even though neither of us planned it." "You said you would ask nothing of me," Tabitha said, remembering the description she had heard people use when they talked about the auction. "Is that true?" Thomas met her eyes steadily. "I am not going to force myself on you if that is what you are asking. You are my wife legally, but that does not give me the right to hurt you or demand things you are not willing to give. I figure we need to build trust first, and that takes time." The relief that washed over Tabitha was so intense it almost made her knees weak. She had been steeling herself for the possibility that he would insist on his marital rights immediately, that she would have to submit to a stranger's touch before she even knew his middle name. The fact that he was offering her time, space, was more than she had dared to hope for. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That means more than you probably know." "I think I know," Thomas said gently. Penelope stood up, her expression uncertain. "What happens now? Do you leave town together? Does Tabitha stay in our house?" "That is up to your sister," Thomas said. "I have no plans to rush anywhere. If she wants to stay in your house for now while we get to know each other, that is fine with me. If she wants to find somewhere else, we can do that too. I am flexible." Tabitha thought about it, weighing options and possibilities. Part of her wanted to cling to the familiar, to sleep in her own bed and pretend that nothing had changed. But another part, the part that had climbed onto that platform and offered herself for sale, knew that she could not move forward by looking backward. "I will get my things from the house," she said slowly. "The important things, anyway, and I will stay here with you because you are my husband and we need to start somewhere. But Penelope, the house is yours now. You can stay there or sell it or do whatever you think is best." "I will stay," Penelope said quickly. "At least for now, it is still our home." The sisters looked at each other, and then Penelope crossed the space between them and hugged Tabitha fiercely. "Be careful," she whispered, "and if he turns out to be horrible, you come right back." "I will," Tabitha promised, even though she suspected that was not really an option anymore. After Penelope left, Tabitha and Thomas stood awkwardly in the hotel room, two strangers bound together by law and money but not yet by anything deeper. Finally, Thomas cleared his throat. "I need to go take care of some business at the bank and make arrangements for my horse. Why do not you go collect your things, and I will meet you back here in a couple of hours. That will give us both some time to think." Tabitha nodded gratefully. "That sounds good." She left the hotel and walked through the afternoon streets to the small house that had been her home for so many years. Inside, surrounded by familiar objects and memories, she allowed herself a moment to simply feel the enormity of what had just happened. She had married a stranger. She had saved the mine. She had changed everything in her life in the space of an hour. She packed a carpetbag with clothes and personal items, moving mechanically through the rooms. At the last moment, she picked up the photograph of her parents that sat on the mantel, a formal portrait taken years ago when they had first struck silver and thought all their dreams were coming true. She wrapped it carefully in a scarf and placed it in the bag. When she returned to the hotel, Thomas was already there, standing by the window and looking out at the street. He turned when she entered, and she saw that he had cleaned up, shaved, and changed into fresh clothes. He looked younger without the stubble, and there was a vulnerability to his newly exposed face that made him seem more human, less intimidating. "I spoke to the bank," he said. "The money will be transferred to clear your father's debt tomorrow morning, and I talked to Samuel Porter at your mine. He seems like a good man." "He is," Tabitha said, setting her bag down. "He worked with my father for years. He said if you want to keep operating the mine, he will stay on as foreman and help you manage it. He also said the men would work for reduced wages until the mine starts turning a profit again, if that is what it takes." Tabitha felt tears prick her eyes. "They would do that, apparently," Thomas said. "You have inspired a fair bit of loyalty, Tabitha." It was the first time he had used her given name, and hearing it in his deep voice sent a strange flutter through her chest. "What about you?" she asked. "What do you want to do? You just spent your fortune. Do you have any plans?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I have been thinking about that. I know cattle and I know mining. Your mine needs help, needs someone who understands the business side and can keep things running efficiently. If you are willing, I would like to work on getting it back to profitability. Consider it my investment in our future. You would do that?" Tabitha asked, stunned. "After already paying so much, Tabitha," Thomas said gently, "I did not spend that money just to save some mine I will never see again. I spent it to marry you, and that means your problems are my problems now. We are in this together." The sincerity in his voice, in his eyes, made something crack open inside her chest. She had been prepared for so many things, but not for simple kindness, not for a man who seemed to actually mean his vows about partnership and mutual support. "I do not know what to say," she admitted. "You do not have to say anything," Thomas replied. "We are both figuring this out as we go." They spent the rest of the evening talking, carefully sharing pieces of their lives with each other like people trading valuable coins. Tabitha told him about growing up in Leadville, about watching the town transform from a rough mining camp into a real city, about her father's dreams and disappointments. Thomas told her about cattle drives and desert towns, about the people he had known and the places he had seen. They ordered dinner from the hotel restaurant and ate at the small table while the sun set outside the window, painting the mountains in shades of orange and purple. When full darkness fell, the question of sleeping arrangements loomed unavoidably. There was only one bed, and though it was large enough for two people, the intimacy of sharing it felt overwhelming. "I can sleep on the floor," Thomas offered. "I have slept in worse places." "That is ridiculous," Tabitha said, though her heart was racing. "You paid for this room and you have been nothing but respectful. We can share the bed, just stay on your side." "I will," Thomas promised. They prepared for bed with exaggerated modesty, Thomas turning away while Tabitha changed into her nightgown behind a screen, then switching places so he could remove his shirt and boots. When they finally lay down in the darkness, careful to maintain space between them, Tabitha found herself acutely aware of his presence, of his breathing, of the warmth radiating from his body. "Thomas," she said quietly. "Yes, thank you for today, for all of it." "You are welcome," he replied. "Sleep well, Tabitha." She closed her eyes and, against all expectations, drifted into sleep with a sense of peace she had not felt in months. The next weeks fell into a pattern that surprised both of them with its ease. Thomas threw himself into the work of understanding the mine, spending long hours with Samuel Porter learning the business, examining the books, and talking to the workers about the challenges they faced. He had a natural authority that men respected, and within days, he had reorganized the work schedule and the equipment maintenance in ways that immediately improved efficiency. Tabitha found herself drawn into the work as well, her knowledge of the mine's history combining with Thomas's practical experience to create a partnership that was more effective than either of them could have been alone. They would spend the days at the mine, or in the office going over accounts, and then return to the hotel in the evenings to talk over dinner about what they had learned and what needed to change. Slowly, carefully, they were building something together. Not yet love, but friendship, respect, a foundation on which something deeper might eventually grow. Thomas continued to sleep on his side of the bed, true to his word, though sometimes Tabitha would wake in the night to find that they had both migrated toward the middle, seeking warmth without conscious thought. The town watched them with fascination, this couple born from such unusual circumstances who seemed to be making it work against all odds. Some people were disappointed that there was no scandal, no dramatic conflict. Others were quietly pleased that Tabitha's gamble had paid off, that she had found not just a solution to her financial problems, but possibly something more. About 3 weeks after the wedding, Tabitha was working in the mine office when Martha Williams came to visit, her baby daughter cradled against her shoulder. "I wanted to thank you properly," Martha said, settling into a chair. "Henry and I were talking last night about how we would have had to leave Leadville if the mine had closed, would have had to go back east to my parents with nothing to show for 5 years of hard work. But because of what you did, we can stay. Our daughter can grow up here and maybe things will get better." "It was not just me," Tabitha said. "Thomas is the one who paid the money." "But you were the one who had the courage to stand up there," Martha replied. "And from what I see, you got yourself a good man in the bargain." That is more than many women can say, even when they marry for love. After Martha left, Tabitha sat thinking about what she had said. Was Thomas a good man? Everything she had seen suggested he was. He worked hard, treated people fairly, kept his promises, and respected her boundaries. But there was still so much she did not know about him, depths she had not yet explored. That night, emboldened by Martha's visit, Tabitha decided to ask some of the questions that had been building in her mind. "You said you worked as a deputy in New Mexico," she said as they ate dinner in their room. "What made you stop? Thomas set down his fork, his expression growing distant. "I was working for a sheriff who turned out to be taking bribes from a gang that was stealing cattle. When I figured it out and confronted him, he tried to have me killed. I managed to get away, but I could not prove what he had done, and I knew if I stayed, he would just try again. So I moved on." "That must have been hard," Tabitha said softly, "realizing you were working for someone corrupt." "It was," Thomas admitted. "It made me lose faith in the law for a while, made me think that maybe there was no point in trying to do the right thing. But then I would see people like you, willing to sacrifice everything for others, and it reminded me that good people still exist, that honor still matters." "You make me sound much nobler than I am," Tabitha said. "I was just trying to save the mine." "You were trying to save 47 families," Thomas corrected. "That is noble, whether you want to admit it or not." The conversation drifted to other topics, but Tabitha felt like she understood Thomas a little better now, understood the code he lived by, and why her actions at the auction had meant something to him. As October turned to November, the weather grew colder, and snow began to dust the higher peaks around Leadville every morning. The mine was showing signs of improvement under Thomas's management. They had found a small new vein of silver that, while not enough to make them rich, was enough to keep things profitable. The workers were happy, the equipment was functioning properly, and for the first time in years, Tabitha felt like the mine might actually have a future. Her relationship with Thomas was also deepening, though it remained chaste. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, learned each other's habits and preferences, discovered shared humor and interests. Thomas liked to read, which surprised her, and she would often find him with a book in the evenings, losing himself in stories of distant places. Tabitha loved music, and Thomas bought her a small music box that played a waltz, just so he could see her smile when she wound it up. They were becoming partners in the truest sense, and with that partnership came a growing attraction that neither of them spoke about but both felt. Tabitha found herself noticing the way Thomas's shirt pulled across his shoulders when he worked, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. She began to crave his presence when he was away, to feel incomplete until he returned. And Thomas, though he tried to hide it, watched her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, his gaze following her movements as if he was memorizing every detail. One cold evening in late November, they returned from the mine to find the hotel room warmer than usual, the proprietor having stoked the fire against the increasing chill. Tabitha stood by the window, watching snow begin to fall in lazy spirals, and felt Thomas come to stand beside her. "First real snow of the season," he said quietly. "It will be a hard winter," Tabitha replied. "It always is up here." "I have been thinking," Thomas said, and there was something different in his voice, something that made her turn to look at him. "We have been married for almost 2 months now, and I think we have done pretty well at this partnership thing." "I think so too," Tabitha agreed, her heart starting to beat faster. "But we have been living like roommates, not like husband and wife," Thomas continued. "And I want you to know that I am not going to push you, not going to demand anything you are not ready to give. But I also want you to know that my feelings for you have changed. I care about you, Tabitha, more than I thought possible in such a short time." Tabitha looked up at him, at this man who had saved her without asking for anything in return, who had worked beside her and respected her, and made her laugh when she thought she had forgotten how. "My feelings have changed too," she admitted. "I did not expect to care about you, but I do. I think about you constantly. When you are not here, I miss you." Thomas reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his calloused hand. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, his voice rough. "Yes," Tabitha whispered. He kissed her gently, carefully, as if she was something precious that might break. His lips were warm and soft, and the kiss sent heat flooding through her entire body. She leaned into him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the solid warmth of him beneath her palms. The kiss deepened, and Tabitha felt something inside her unfurl, some tightly held control releasing as she realized this was what she wanted, that she wanted him. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that for weeks," he admitted. "So have I," Tabitha said. "I just did not know how to tell you. We are quite a pair," Thomas said with a low laugh. "Both too scared to say what we want." "I am saying it now," Tabitha said, gathering her courage. "I want you, Thomas. As my husband, truly, if you want me to." "I have wanted you since I first saw you standing on that platform," Thomas said fiercely. "Brave and terrified and absolutely magnificent." He kissed her again, and this time there was less gentleness and more hunger, more need. Tabitha responded with equal passion, her fingers tangling in his hair, her body pressing against his. They stumbled toward the bed, shedding clothes awkwardly, laughing breathlessly at their own eagerness. That night, they truly became husband and wife in every sense, and Tabitha discovered that Thomas was as considerate a lover as he was a partner, patient and attentive, and determined to make sure she found as much pleasure as he did. Afterward, lying tangled together in the warmth of the bed, Tabitha felt a happiness so complete it almost frightened her. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. Thomas pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I love you too. I think I have from the moment you agreed to take that leap of faith with me." Winter settled over Leadville with its customary harshness, but inside the hotel room that had become their sanctuary, Tabitha and Thomas built their own warmth. They continued to work at the mine, which was slowly becoming more profitable, and their evenings were spent in domestic contentment and passionate rediscovery of each other. In December, Penelope announced she was planning to marry a schoolteacher who had recently arrived in town, a kind man named David Foster who shared her love of books and had none of the rough edges so common in mining towns. The sisters reconciled fully, any lingering tension over Tabitha's decision melting away now that it was clear she had found genuine happiness. As Christmas approached, Thomas surprised Tabitha by renting a small house on the edge of town, a cozy place with 2 bedrooms, a real kitchen, and a parlor with a fireplace. "I thought we might want our own place," he said as he showed her through it. "The hotel has been fine, but this could be a real home, our home." Tabitha walked through the empty rooms, imagining filling them with furniture and life, and felt tears of joy streaming down her face. "It is perfect," she said. "Absolutely perfect." They moved in during the week before Christmas, and suddenly, Tabitha found herself playing house in a way she never had before, arranging their few possessions and planning meals and making curtains for the windows. Thomas built furniture in the evenings, his skilled hands crafting a table and chairs, shelves for books, a rocking chair he insisted would be useful someday, though he would not say why. On Christmas Eve, they invited Penelope and David to dinner, along with Samuel Porter and his wife, and Martha and Henry Williams and their baby. It was a simple meal of roasted chicken and vegetables, but the laughter and warmth that filled the little house made it feel like a feast. After everyone had gone home, Thomas and Tabitha sat by the fire, her head resting on his shoulder, and watched the flames dance. "A year ago, I never could have imagined this," Tabitha said softly. "Being this happy, having so much. A year ago, I was drifting through Texas with no idea where I was going," Thomas replied. "Funny how life works." "You ever regret it?" Tabitha asked. Spending all that money on me, Thomas tilted her chin up so he could look into her eyes. Not for one single second. Best investment I ever made. He kissed her tenderly, and the kiss deepened into something more urgent. They made love in front of the fire, slow and sweet, and Tabitha thought she had never felt more cherished, more loved, more completely seen. As 1881 turned into 1882, the mine continued its slow but steady recovery. Thomas had proven to have a real talent for the business side of mining, negotiating better prices for the silver they produced and finding new markets for their ore. Tabitha worked beside him, her knowledge of the mine's history and the workers combining with his business acumen to create a genuinely successful partnership. In March, Tabitha realized she had missed her monthly courses for the second time. She waited another week to be sure, then told Thomas one evening as they lay in bed. "I think I am pregnant," she said quietly, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. Thomas went very still beside her, then rolled over to look at her, his eyes wide with wonder. "Are you certain?" "Not entirely," Tabitha admitted, "but the signs are there. I think by summer we will have a baby." "A baby," Thomas repeated, and then a grin spread across his face so wide and joyful that it made Tabitha's heart soar. "We are going to have a baby." He kissed her deeply, his hand coming to rest over hers on her stomach, as if he could already feel the life growing there. "I am going to be a father," he said, awed. "I never thought I would get to say that." "You are going to be a wonderful father," Tabitha assured him. "I have seen how you are with the children at the mine, how gentle you are with Martha's baby. This child is going to be so loved." The pregnancy progressed normally, and as Tabitha's belly swelled through the spring and summer, Thomas became increasingly protective and attentive. He would not let her work too hard at the mine, insisted she rest every afternoon, and catered to her strange cravings with patient amusement. In late August, on a warm afternoon when the sun beat down on Leadville with unusual intensity, Tabitha went into labor. The birth was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day, with Thomas pacing the floor outside their bedroom while the midwife and Martha Williams attended to Tabitha. But finally, as the sun reached its zenith on the second day, a baby's cry pierced the air and Thomas was allowed into the room. Tabitha lay exhausted but glowing, cradling a tiny bundle in her arms. "It is a boy," she said softly as Thomas approached. "A healthy, perfect boy." Thomas knelt beside the bed, looking down at his son with an expression of pure wonder. The baby had a shock of dark hair and was waving tiny fists in apparent outrage at having been evicted from his warm home. "He is beautiful," Thomas whispered, "just like his mother. What should we name him?" Tabitha asked. They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy but had never quite settled on one. Now, looking at their son, Thomas said thoughtfully, "What about James, after your father?" Tabitha felt tears spill down her cheeks. "James Jarrett, I love it. My father would have been so proud." "I hope I can be half the man he was," Thomas said softly. "You already are," Tabitha assured him. "You saved us, Thomas. You saved me and the mine and all those families. My father would have loved you." They spent the afternoon as a family. Thomas sitting on the edge of the bed, holding his son with awkward care, while Tabitha rested. As evening fell and the baby nursed for the first time, Tabitha looked at her husband and felt overwhelmed by gratitude for the strange path that had brought them together. "I cannot believe it has only been a year since the auction," she said. "It feels like a lifetime ago." "In some ways it was," Thomas replied. "We were different people then. We have built something real together, Tabitha, something that will last." The years that followed proved him right. The Kensington mine, now officially renamed the Jarrett Silver Mine, became one of the more successful operations in Leadville. never wildly profitable but steady and reliable. Thomas's careful management and Tabitha's knowledge created a business that provided good wages for its workers and enough income for the Jarrett family to live comfortably. Little James grew into a bright, energetic child who loved nothing more than following his father around the mine, asking endless questions about ore and tunnels and explosions. In 1884, Tabitha gave birth to a daughter they named Caroline, a sweet-tempered child with her mother's dark hair and her father's gray-blue eyes. 2 years later came another son, Michael, who was stubborn and fearless from birth. The little house on the edge of town expanded to accommodate the growing family, Thomas adding rooms with his own hands whenever another baby arrived. Penelope and David Foster had 3 children of their own, and the two families spent holidays and Sundays together, creating the kind of extended family warmth that both Tabitha and Thomas had missed in their earlier lives. Samuel Porter eventually retired, and Thomas took over as the full owner and operator of the mine, buying out the remaining debt and putting the profits back into the business. He was known throughout Leadville as a fair boss who treated his workers well and never asked them to do anything he would not do himself. Men wanted to work for him, and the mine's reputation grew accordingly. Tabitha became involved in civic affairs, joining with other women to establish a proper school and a library, working to bring culture and education to the rough mining town. She never forgot the desperation that had driven her to that auction platform, and she used her relative prosperity to help other families in need, quietly paying off debts and providing assistance to widows and orphans. As their 10th anniversary approached in October 1891, Thomas planned a surprise for Tabitha. He had been saving money for years, setting aside a little bit each month, and now he used it to book passage on a train to San Francisco. He arranged for Penelope to watch the children for 2 weeks, and then he told his wife they were going on a delayed honeymoon. Tabitha was stunned and delighted, having never traveled beyond Colorado. The train journey across the western states was an adventure in itself, and San Francisco was a revelation. A real city with grand buildings, theaters, restaurants, and the vast Pacific Ocean stretching to the horizon. They stayed in a fine hotel and ate in expensive restaurants, went to the theater and walked along the waterfront, and rediscovered each other away from the responsibilities of the mine and the children. On their last night in the city, sitting in their hotel room overlooking the bay, Thomas took Tabitha's hand and spoke seriously. "I have been thinking about that day 10 years ago," he said. "About the auction, and how scared you looked and how brave you were. I want you to know that marrying you was the best decision I ever made, and I would pay that money again 1,000 times over for what we have built together." "I was terrified," Tabitha admitted. "I thought I was throwing my life away, that I would end up trapped with someone cruel or indifferent. I never imagined I would find this. We have been so lucky, Thomas." "Not luck," Thomas said firmly. "Hard work and honesty and choosing each other every single day. That is what has made this work." "You are right," Tabitha agreed, "and I choose you today and always. I love you more now than I thought possible to love another person." They made love that night with the tenderness of long intimacy, each knowing exactly how to please the other, and Tabitha felt grateful beyond words for the strange auction that had brought her this man, this life, this happiness. They returned to Leadville refreshed and ready to face whatever the future held. The children were overjoyed to have them back, jumping and shouting and demanding presents and stories. The mine was running smoothly under the temporary oversight of the foreman Thomas had trained. Life resumed its comfortable patterns. More years passed, marked by birthdays and holidays, by small triumphs and occasional setbacks. In 1893, the silver market crashed, and many mines around Leadville closed permanently. The Jarrett mine survived because Thomas had diversified, investing in other businesses around town and maintaining a financial cushion against hard times. They had to reduce wages temporarily and lay off a few workers, but they weathered the crisis better than most. James, their eldest, eventually decided he did not want to be a miner, much to everyone's surprise. He loved books and learning, and Thomas and Tabitha supported his desire to go east to college, proud even as they missed him terribly. Caroline proved to have a head for business and began helping her father with the mine's accounts when she was barely 15. Michael was the adventurer, talking constantly about traveling the world and seeing everything there was to see. As Tabitha approached 40, she sometimes thought about the woman she had been at 23, standing on that platform and offering herself for sale to save a failing mine. That woman had been desperate and brave and terrified, willing to sacrifice everything for people she cared about. Looking back, Tabitha could see that she had not really understood what she was risking, how much she had been gambling on chance and hope. But somehow, miraculously, it had worked out. She had found not just a solution to her immediate problem, but a true partner, a genuine love, a life richer and fuller than anything she had imagined in those dark days before the auction. One evening in October 1901, exactly 20 years after that fateful auction, Tabitha and Thomas sat on the porch of their house watching the sun set over the mountains. The children were grown now. James working as a lawyer in Denver, Caroline married to a mining engineer and expecting her first child, Michael off on some adventure in South America. The house felt quiet without them, but it was a peaceful quiet, the kind that comes from a life well lived. 20 years, Tabitha said softly. Can you believe it? Some days, yes, Thomas replied, reaching over to take her hand. Other days it feels like just yesterday that I saw you standing up there looking so fierce and frightened. I cannot imagine my life without you in it, Tabitha said. Cannot imagine who I would be if you had not bid that day. You would have been fine, Thomas said. You are the strongest person I know, Tabitha. You would have found a way. Maybe, Tabitha conceded, but it would not have been this way. It would not have been us. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn from blue to orange to purple to black, the stars emerging one by one overhead. Tabitha thought about all the years stretching behind them, all the moments of joy and sorrow, triumph and struggle that had woven together to create the tapestry of their life. You ever wonder what people say about us? She asked. About how we started. Probably that we are the craziest, luckiest people in Leadville, Thomas said with a laugh, and they would be right. I prefer to think we were brave, Tabitha said. Both of us. You for taking a chance on a stranger and me for accepting help from one. Brave and crazy are not mutually exclusive, Thomas pointed out. Tabitha laughed, the sound carrying across the quiet evening. No, I suppose they are not. As they sat together in the gathering darkness, Tabitha reflected on the unexpected paths life could take, the way desperation could transform into blessing, how the worst moments could become the seeds of the best years. She had auctioned herself to save a town, and a cowboy had paid every cent and asked nothing in return except a chance. And from that unlikely beginning, they had built a love that had lasted 2 decades and would, she knew with absolute certainty, last the rest of their lives. The mine continued to operate profitably, now managed mostly by Caroline's husband, with Thomas serving as an advisor rather than the daily operator. Thomas and Tabitha had more time for each other, and they used it to travel a bit, visit their children, and simply enjoy the companionship they had forged over 2 decades of partnership. In 1903, Caroline gave birth to her second child, a daughter she named Tabitha after her mother. Holding her tiny granddaughter, Tabitha felt the circle of life continuing, felt the legacy of that desperate auction day extending into the future in ways she never could have anticipated. This baby would grow up in a different world, with opportunities and choices that Tabitha had never had, and that progress felt like a gift. As Tabitha and Thomas grew older together, their love only deepened, tempered by time and strengthened by shared experience. They knew each other's stories by heart, could finish each other's sentences, and still found joy in simple pleasures: morning coffee together, evening walks, the sound of grandchildren's laughter filling their house. In the winter of 1906, Thomas fell ill with pneumonia. For a terrifying week, Tabitha sat by his bedside applying cold compresses and spooning broth into him, praying desperately that she would not lose him. He recovered, but the illness left him weaker, and they both understood that they were entering the final chapter of their lives. "I am not ready to leave you," Thomas said one evening as they sat together in front of the fire, a blanket wrapped around both of them. "Then do not," Tabitha said fiercely. "Stay with me. We still have so much time left," and they did have time, more than a decade more, in fact. They celebrated their 30th anniversary in 1911, surrounded by children and grandchildren and friends, and Thomas gave a toast in which he told the story of the auction, his voice shaking with emotion as he described seeing Tabitha for the first time and knowing that she was worth everything he had. "I paid $15,000 for a bride I did not know," Thomas said, "and got back $1 million worth of love. Best deal I ever made." Everyone laughed and cried, and Tabitha kissed him in front of everyone, not caring who saw, because after 3 decades, she was long past worrying about propriety. They lived to see automobiles become common on the streets of Leadville, to see electricity light up their house, to watch the town they loved transform yet again. James became a respected judge. Caroline's children grew tall and strong, and Michael sent letters from exotic locations around the world describing his adventures. In the spring of 1917, Thomas and Tabitha celebrated their 36th anniversary. They were both in their 70s now, slowed by age but still sharp in mind and deeply in love. They spent the day quietly at home, looking through old photographs and telling stories about the early days of their marriage. "You have any regrets?" Tabitha asked as the sun set and they sat together on the porch, just as they had done so many times before. Thomas was silent for a long moment, considering the question seriously. "I regret that I did not find you sooner," he finally said. "I wish we could have had even more years together. But I do not regret a single day of the life we have lived. You have made me happier than I ever dreamed possible, Tabitha. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." "And you are the best thing that ever happened to me," Tabitha replied, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved me, Thomas." "In every way a person can be saved." "We saved each other," Thomas corrected gently. "That is what love is, I think. 2 people choosing to save each other every single day." Thomas passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 years later in the summer of 1919. Tabitha woke one morning to find him still beside her, his face peaceful and his hand still holding hers, and she knew he was gone. The grief was overwhelming, a tidal wave that threatened to drown her, but underneath, it was gratitude for 38 years of partnership, of love, of choosing each other day after day after day. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, miners and businessmen and friends, all coming to pay their respects to a man who had been fair and honest and kind throughout his long life. Tabitha stood tall throughout the service, supported by her children and grandchildren, and when it came time to speak, she told the truth about how they had met, how he had saved her with a single audacious bid and asked nothing in return. "He gave me everything," she said, looking out at the sea of faces. "His money, his work, his loyalty, his love. And in return, I tried every day to be worthy of the gift he gave me. I do not know if I succeeded, but I know that I loved him with everything I had, and that he loved me the same way. We built a good life together, and I will be grateful for that, until my last breath." Tabitha lived for another 5 years after Thomas's death, surrounded by family and sustained by the deep well of love they had built together. She never remarried. She had no interest in anyone else after having known a love as profound as what she and Thomas had shared. Instead, she focused on her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, telling them stories about the old days, about the auction that had changed everything, about the cowboy who had paid every cent and asked nothing. On a cool October evening in 1924, exactly 43 years after she had stood on that platform and offered herself for sale, Tabitha Jarrett passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 66. She was buried beside Thomas in the Leadville cemetery, their headstones side by side as they had been in life. The inscription on her headstone read, "Beloved wife, mother, grandmother, she was brave enough to leap and found someone brave enough to catch her." The mine they had saved together continued to operate until the 1950s, outlasting almost all the other silver mines in Leadville and providing livelihoods for 3 generations of families. The little house on the edge of town remained in the family, eventually becoming a museum dedicated to the story of Tabitha and Thomas, a testament to the power of desperation, generosity, and love to transform lives. Their descendants spread across the country, carrying with them the story of the grandmother who had auctioned herself to save a town and the grandfather who had paid everything and asked nothing in return. It became a family legend, passed down through generations, a reminder that sometimes the most desperate moments could lead to the greatest blessings, that love could be found in the most unexpected places, and that true partnership required both courage and trust. In the end, Tabitha and Thomas's story was one of ordinary people making extraordinary choices, of risking everything for what mattered most, and of building a love so strong that it lasted a lifetime and beyond. It was a story of the Wild West, of silver booms and mining towns, of hardship and hope. But most of all, it was a story of 2 souls finding each other against all odds and choosing, every single day for 38 years, to build something beautiful together. And that, perhaps, was the greatest treasure either of them ever found. Not silver pulled from the mountains, but love forged in the crucible of trust and tested by time. A love that began with an auction and a bid and a leap of faith, and that endured through decades of joy and sorrow, triumph and struggle, until death itself could not diminish what they had built together. Their love story became legend in Leadville, told and retold until it was hard to separate fact from embellishment. But the core truth remained constant. She had been brave enough to offer herself to save others, and he had been generous enough to pay everything without asking for anything in return. And from that unlikely beginning, they had created something rare and precious, a partnership built on mutual respect and deepening love that sustained them through all the challenges life threw their way. In the years after both had passed, people would visit their graves in the cemetery overlooking Leadville and the mountains beyond, reading the inscriptions and imagining the story of 2 people who had dared to trust strangers, who had built something beautiful from desperation and generosity. Young couples would stand hand in hand, wondering if their own love could last as long and burn as bright. Old couples would remember their own beginnings and feel grateful for the years they had been given. And always, the story would end the same way, with Tabitha and Thomas together as they had been in life, as they would be in memory, as they were in the hearts of all who knew them. A love story for the ages, born in the Wild West, tempered by hardship and strong enough to last beyond death itself. She had auctioned herself to save the town. The cowboy had paid every cent and asked nothing, and together they had built a love that saved them both.